So I wanted to share with you this small presentation, which is basically the result of me exploring with different eyes what I did during my PhD dissertation at Freiburg University. So in order to understand a little bit, in order to give an argument during this talk, I'm going to explain what I did back in 2012, 13, 14, where I was doing my fieldwork research and of my PhD dissertation. And eventually, I'm going to talk a little bit about something that spiked my attention from the STANDD talk series, which is the idea of territories of life. And I mean, in previous conversations with Nick, I had the idea to try to look back at what I did back then through different eyes. So this is kind of a new exercise that I hope can generate some insights and feedback. So here we go. So why an ethnography of mobilities of Roma people, especially in the Americas? Well, precisely because there was a point, and I have been working on this before my PhD, in which we needed to start explaining to academia, of course, not the Romani people in Colombia and in other countries like Canada or the US have their own explanations to why they are in the Americas. But we needed to explain to academia or give ourselves an explanation to why there's Romani presence in the Americas and why such traces are the pictures that I show here, which are fashion magazines mentioning the arrival of Roma people in the 40s and the 50s in Colombia. So another important motivation was once I started to study in Europe, this particular topic, I realized that Romani studies are usually revolving around Europe. Something that could be labeled, using a term that is used in migration studies, as methodological continentalism. And you can see it really well in this map. You see how there's this very detailed understanding of what happens inside the subcontinent of Europe and a little bit in the margins. And then there's like a little arrow to America, which doesn't tell us anything and puts just a random date there, which kind of eliminates the fact that there has been a continuous presence of Roma people since the first contact between Europe and the Americas. So basically, my dissertation revolved around two sets of questions. The first one was why, who, where, when, and how Romani people came to the Americas. Specifically, I started this journey from Colombia, but also in any other countries in the continent. And the second set of questions had to do with what made those journeys possible, the travel, the migration, however we want to call them, and we will refine those terms in a bit. And those things, or let's call them concepts that made them possible, included networks, media, all of the physical, historical, political, social contexts, and the materialities, etc. So which methods did I use to go through this? Well, here are the objectives in case they were not clear before. So the first objective was to describe practices, experiences, and meanings of those movements across the Atlantic and within the Americas of Romani groups, and how ideologies, discourses, and metaphors give meaning to those movements, kind of create a discursive regime around them. So this methodological path, and this is important because I come from Colombian anthropology, and this means that there was an overt focus on local communities, territories, and the idea of displacement and by result, like violence. And I talked a lot in my thesis about different divides. We will see that later, like divides between the civilized and the wild, or the white and black in studies of race. But there was a particular divide that I didn't explore in my thesis, the urban versus rural divide. Although I realized later after talking with Nick that there's data that could help us understand how complicated this divide is, that this binarism. The methodological path also responded to the idea of how me being formed in this kind of anthropology, then engaged with Roma groups that live in the city of Bogota. And eventually they told me, Esteban, in order to take us seriously, you have to come with us. Venga con nosotros, they said. Why? Because they needed to show me the connections that they had to other localities, other places. In 2018, I wrote a tiny article that gives an example of this. We were at a visit in which the original objective was filling out some linguistic surveys that I was helping a colleague from France do. But this visit became not only an academic endeavor, but also a family endeavor in which the whole family was there, and a mediated encounter with a marriage that was going on in Venezuela, across the Colombian and Venezuelan border, through cell phones. So one specific moment became connected and tied to not only to different types of sociality, but also to other places and other localities where things were happening. So how did I conceive the ethnographic field for this endeavor? Well, first, we need to understand that ethnographers have always thought about human movement, including, early anthropologists. But the issue is that now we're thinking about it in a bit of a different way, in the sense that it is the context of exploration right now, of anthropological exploration, has to do with this idea of going beyond the isomorphism or the melding of space, place, and culture, precisely because they not always go hand in hand. And since I've been giving examples of the case of Romani families in Colombia, in their case and in other Romani families that I met throughout my my fieldwork, it was not the case either, or it was definitely not the case. And this had to do with how I shaped this ethnography as translocal and as focused on mobilities, connections, instead of sites. So in this way, place was conceived as meeting points and intersections, relations that are weaved together and are constituted by these mobilities. So it's a bit of a shift in the way we think about place that has been going on both in anthropology and in interdisciplinary fields like mobility studies or migration studies. So the original idea was to go into contact zones a la Pratt, and go and spend some time in Toronto, Budapest, Bogota as sites. But then eventually I realized that didn't make much sense, and that I had to focus both on networks, connections, and the friction between these localities and all of these mobilities and things that were happening that couldn't be pinned down to a particular locality that easily. Here are two pictures, one in Budapest, where I spent several field stays. The longest one was 3 months, and then in Toronto, where there's a community center where I worked also for a while during this field work. I'm going to focus though on my time in Bogota in Colombia, and how staying in Bogota resulted in me traveling to other parts of the country and understanding that Bogota was also connected to other places in South America and the world and the continent. So these zones became zones of friction where there's like an awkward, unequal, unstable, uh, um, like situation that needs to be apprehended and described by an ethnographer like myself, like quoting Anand Singh. And in turn, these are connected with specific universals that she refers to in her book, Friction. And in this case, I was concentrated on universals that had to do with mobility or migration, regimes of migration, regimes of mobility. This kind of materialized in a specific moment in which I found this particular poster in the Toronto Roma Community Center. And I had seen it before. So I asked one of the persons, Paul Sinclair, who used to be at the head of the Roma Community Center before, to bring it down because I wanted to read it. And it turns out that it had, in red, you can see, it has a quote from Gabriel Garcia Marquez, Colombian author. And if you see down in the frame, it tells us that this particular group of Roma people came from a district in Colombia called Boyacá. And this poster particularly was donated by a Bosnian refugee that was seeking asylum in Toronto that had been in South America for a particular meeting. So eventually I found the same poster in Bogota, which is the second picture. And I started to ask myself, well, or to tell myself, well, there's something to these connections and this. If just a poster can travel from Bogota to Toronto, of course people can do it. So in a way, the approximation to these networks and these mobilities had to do with the fact that these are mobile. Like these practices, these mobilities are in a redundant way mobile. They're dispersed. You need to move in space in order to apprehend it, because that's how they are created and that's how people perceive them as well. That's why my Roma friends were telling me, hey, come with us. So which techniques did I use? I mean, this is not new anymore, like the idea of multi-sided ethnographer and following the people, the metaphor, the life of people, as well as techniques from walking ethnography, walking with, from Tim Ingold, but understanding that that walking or moving also creates these places. And this is something that I didn't emphasize during my dissertation, but now that I was compelled to think about territories, it started to make more sense, more and more sense. How does this materialize? This is a picture in the streets of Bogota, going along, we could say it like that, with Tosa and Nubia, two dear friends that had invited me to go around in their neighborhood and understand how they live their daily life, going around, visiting relatives, working, etc. And this is one of the pictures that I could take during that time. So we are in a city, and this is going to tie up with this urban-rural divide later. And these techniques, or the techniques that I used, were basically designed to apprehend what Bell Hooks calls journeys, which is this enmeshment of mobile practices and experiences with power. And it's precisely why mobile ethnography and work-alongs, ride-alongs, go-alongs worked so well as in-depth interviews that sometimes had to be on the move. And at the same time, because I was so focused on meanings, I had to create a parallel project of discourse tracing, finding how people gave meaning to these experiences and these mobilities both the people that were experiencing them and the people that intended to control them, like the state or local authorities, amongst others. So the project basically was an intensive multi-sided engagement from 2012 to 2014, which 1 year in 2013 of very intensive multi-sided fieldwork. There were multiple points of entry, like in each place, in each zone. There were previous contacts. I did volunteer work, youth activism, and followed kinship and friendship networks, all at the same time in order to apprehend this kind of nebulous idea of connections and networks. I recorded 32 interviews in different places, in Colombia specifically, around I think 13, 14. Each of them very intensive, from 1 to 4 hours, and many times different sessions of talking about life stories and histories of movement, these journeys that Bell Hooks refers to. So what did I find? I'm just going to talk about 2 families specifically, because they relate to what I want to talk about later about territory and the idea and spatialities. Before diving into the histories of these families and what they conveyed to me, the source revision, what kind of popped back from this secondary source revision was this idea of the need to problematize assumptions that we have on mobility, this idea that mobilities are problems that need to be solved, and then there's some kind of historical essence of when it comes to mobilities. And so it was very usual to see people understanding how Romani people move through binary couplings, like nomadism versus sedentarism, or migration versus citizenry, and rural versus urban, which is like something that I didn't go deep enough during the thesis. And these regimes, these discursive regimes, have been naturalized. It's very common to just refer to them without thinking about them. Concretely with Romani people, Peter Kabachnik refers to the myth of the placeless gypsy, which is this idea that Romani people have no ties whatsoever to any place in the world. And he gives the example of the work of David Sibley, where he talks about that in England, people like travelers or gypsies are indifferent to stopping places. It doesn't matter if they're in England or in Uruguay. And Kabachnik does a really interesting critique of this, referring to this kind of impossibility of the places gypsy. It just doesn't exist. It's an idea. It's an idea. Yeah. But the other thing that I found during my explorations is that people didn't realize that that sentence had another political component, and is this idea of referring to England or Uruguay as same places, when Uruguay has, and the rest of Latin America, has very strong colonized relations with colonization with European centers. In the one that is referred to the most is the Spanish or the Portuguese empires, but the South Cone, Argentina and Uruguay and other countries also had during the 19th century really strong colonial ties to the British Empire economically. So these dimensions didn't appear at all in analysis. Only until very recently, people have started to realize how the idea of the gypsy or the gitano in the Spanish Empire was tied to how indigenous people were understood in the Americas. And at the same time, while Gitanos were being reduced and expelled from the Iberian Peninsula, it was the same time that efforts of colonization were taking place in countries like Colombia or the Caribbean, Mexico, etc. So, and for my specific thesis, there was another important binary that was very was crucial to address, which was this nomadism versus sedentarism and how it was used to control mobilities of Romani people, and to give meaning to those mobilities. So in the concrete case of a family, let's call them the Greco family. Their last name is Jankovic. They arrived by boat to Brazil and Argentina from the ex-Yugoslavia, where today is Serbia. And what was very interesting, besides, I mean, the wonderful experiences of travel, is that because I was focused on mobilities, I forgot about their actual relationships with locality. And although I described them in my thesis, I didn't emphasize them. So I want to emphasize them today. And this idea that they were part of the efforts of colonization of certain places, as, let's call them like the point of the spear. Like they say there were no roads, but there were horses. My father came through the jungle. So they basically had to make those roads. They were part of the colonizing efforts of creating landscapes and creating what we know as what we now know as, for example, the Amazon plains, or what some people back then considered the jungle. So they were used to making, because they were used to travel around in Latin America, they were used to making roads for their horses first, and then later for trucks. This is a picture of the encampment of this particular family in Pasto, the one of the cities in the southwest of Colombia, which is high up in the Andes, and a very interesting point of connection between Colombia and Ecuador. So the Greco family, based in Pasto, and they were very conscious that they wanted to return on and on to Pasto, had been basically traversing the whole American continent during 1 or 2 lifetimes, and by using the skills that they had as metal crafters, as sales people, and as mechanics, and in order to live a life that allowed them to go from place to place earning a living. Here's the picture of one of the old bellows that they used to use to do metal work, copper, aluminum later, and stuff like that, inside one of these tents. I guess it's one of the last ones that ever existed, because the person that I interviewed unfortunately passed away, and he was the last one that had one of these. And during this time of traveling through these skills, they created a relationship with plantation economies. So they made the metal utensils that were used for sugarcane exploitation, for example. And these movements occurred within Romani networks. So they would arrive where they had family in each of the different countries. I also wanted to mention the case of the Migai family, which is a different family that didn't go around the world. The Greco family, when displacement became a rule in Colombia and people had to leave because of the violence in the 30s, 40s, and 50s, they ended up in Argentina, traversed the whole continent, they went back, then migrated to Central America, Mexico, and California. And then they decided to come back in the 90s to Colombia. So they were very transnational. But what happens with a family that was not transnational? The Migai decided, instead of migrating outside of Colombia, they migrated within. So they arrived, the memory only extends to their arrival to Mexico. And they also remembered that they brought horse wagons with them in the boats, and horses. And this is important. Why? Because they decided to stay in Colombia and go, instead of staying in the cities as the other families, they went towards the Caribbean plains and places that were not urbanized yet. And they did it by using their skills as horse breeders and horse traders. So here's a little quote that we planned, and in the morning we traveled. It was like this idea that through horse trade, they could take horses from one part of the country to another and sell them. And that became their lifestyle for several decades. So here are some pictures of where they are right now, which is the little town of San Pelayo, where you can only get to by jeep. But it used to be one of the most important places for horse trade in Colombia. And you can see the remnants of the tent life in some of the curtains that they use as doors instead of actual physical wood and stuff like that. So the Migay family, they also had very similar skills as the Grecos, but they made a different decision. They decided to specialize in horses and horse trade and horse tack. They later become leather workers. And they ventured to what in Colombia are called colonization frontiers. This borders between the urban and the rural, where people go to the jungle, to El Monte, and they provided technical knowledge that people in those places needed, as well as non-human beings like horses. So this particular family had very specific relationships with other families that did not dedicate themselves to the horse trade, especially this kind of impressive endeavor that was bringing a team of horses from the Caribbean plains to main cities like Medellin. So they said that other families had farms and had holdings, but they had gold, so they could travel because gold can travel. So how were these mobile practices signified in the specific circumstances that I've been talking about? Well, in the case of Pasto, it's very interesting because they still live in tents. They're still perceived as they have no attachment to place. So when I was there, the police decided to evict them from the place where they were. And when we decided to contest that decision and go to the town hall, the conversation went something like, well, but why do you care? You are nomads. And then they were like, well, yeah, but we have rights. And then they pulled out all of the legislation that exists in Colombia that gives them ethnic rights, and they could prove that being nomadic does not mean that they don't have attachment to a place, let's say Pasto or a particular piece of land. And when we were talking about these things, one of the people that belong to this family told me, Esteban, and he said in a really hushed voice, he said, no one is a nomad because he wants to. We are nomads because we want to stay together. Basically, that's what I interpret he was trying to tell me. We stay in the tents because we want to stay together and we want to live the way that we want to live. But that doesn't mean that if we had the choice to change this, we wouldn't do that. And other families have changed it long ago. They are the last ones to live in tents. The family in the Caribbean referred to the new life that is not in tents as semi-nomadism. And it was even gendered, the discourse around this idea of semi-nomadism, where only men travel and women stay home. And they also were very conscious that this for them were modern decisions brought to them by modernity. Even in the city of Bogota, it was quite fun at some point to be part of documentary filming, a documentary from the Colombian state. And the producer asked one of the elders, oh, can you tell us a little bit about being a nomad? And he kind of hushed to one of his granddaughters, and he asked in Romanes, their language, what is nomad? And she just answered him, well, that we travel a lot. And then he turned out to the camera and said like, oh yeah, for sure, we travel a lot. So for me, it was very interesting to see that only in these two cases the word nomadism came to be, and it was usually tied to this idea of living in tents and living in rural areas and traveling for a living. So what does all of this have to do with territory? I hope I have enough time. I think so. If so, I started after talking with Nick, I started to think about the idea of territory, and reading about it. If I tended to gravitate towards the idea of territory as a process, precisely because not because it's the newest trend, but also because that's how I had seen it in my own fieldwork experiences, and how territory is created through everyday practices, and it's an ensemble of mediated relationships. And the question for me, coming from migration studies and mobility studies, was what is the role of mobilities in this idea of territories? In my thesis, at least, it was mobilities were crucial to maintain these relationships, these connections, and these assemblages that are part of a Romani family or a Romani set of families. So the question that I would bring to the table is, can we think about mobilities and territories harmoniously? This is a map that was brought after the census of 2018 that include the different parts of places where there's Roma people in the country of Colombia. So you can see there's big numbers of people in Bogota, in Girón, in Cúcuta, and in the Caribbean, and in Pasto. So you can see more or less the location, the geographical location of the places I was talking about. So what happened in Colombia after Roma became recognized as an official ethnic group? It was precisely because of the territorial turn and multiculturalism after the 1991 constitution, and a specific presidential decree fixed the territorial unit of the Compania as the way that Roma need to be governed in Colombia. But what does it mean to govern from a standpoint of territory, a group of people that understand themselves as mobile? I don't know the answer. To be honest, I invited Mariana Mendoza, one of the students that we've been talking about this particular subjects, because she has explored even more this relationship between territory and the idea of compania, which was originally multi-scalar translocal belonging and kinship relationship. So people talked about, oh, there's a lot of compania here. That means there's a lot of Roma families here. Or about the compania of Bogota, the people that live in Bogota that are of Romani origin, but also the compania of Colombia, or the compania of the Americas, etc. But it was very malleable and fluid, this idea of compania. And what happens when it clashes with the idea of territory from the eyes or the gaze of the state? It's a problem that we are still dealing with. And maybe my work can give some specific details towards this line of thought. The first nuance that I wanted to talk is this idea of entangled realities of dwelling. Even if you're on the move, what happens when you're dwelling in a tent, in this case? And I call the camp or these tents as tenuous infrastructure. Infrastructure as coming from these ideas of the Anthropocene or the Ecozoic, and this of human-made infrastructure. But what happens when you're in a tent where you're in constant contact with other beings, not only humans? Here a quote of my talk with the people from the Migai family, where they were carrying a large horse team from the Caribbean plains to the cities by land, and they had to sleep out in the open. And they said the tent always was protecting us from snakes. With the fire, we felt the tiger that was around us and wanted to eat our horses. But thank God we were never bitten by a snake. That saved us because there were so many snakes, spiders, and poisonous animals. Maybe God protected us. And this particular quote reminded me of what we were talking about a couple of weeks ago in another one of the talks in the series about the changes that plantation economies bring to places like the Caribbean plains in Colombia, and how people deal with it even when they're out in the open. Um, Other people were even less romantic about this life in camps and in a tent. And then they said there was no toilet. My parents lived in fear and exposed to much danger in a tent. Immediately was caught on fire. I mean, we were like things happened. Danger was there. And interestingly enough, it was a woman that told me these things. There was also a gendered perception of what living in the open and in a mobile life meant in concretely when traveling by horse and in tents. Um, these tents that you saw from Pasto are not made out of cloth anymore. They're basically plastic canvas taken off from um, old trucks and repurposed through industrial glues into these tents. So even the ones that still live in tents have realized that they needed a change in that infrastructure to withstand the weather and whatnot. So, and this reminded me of the idea of dwelling and how dwelling in a place is often influenced by mobile practices, not only of humans, but non-humans. In this case, snakes, tigers, mosquitoes, and other beings. Another detail that I wanted to give in this talk was this idea of practices of transport. In my thesis, I realized, reading it back, that I didn't focus on the horses at all. I didn't understand that there were entanglements between and while being transported, there were entanglements between human beings, in this case, the Romani families, and the people that they were commercing these horses with, and the the horses themselves. Like, what about these horses? This is perhaps the only picture I have of somebody with a horse. And I realized that there was a gap there for this specific talk that needs to be explored further. Why? Because following Ingold, yeah, I mean, sometimes we think about being transported as a very idealistic thing, that we go on a train or on an airplane and we don't do any work. But we already saw how Roma people, although using means of transports like horses or cars, trucks, they were making their way. They were literally making roads in order to get to different places in the country. So routes were literally formed and reformed by the participants of this particular research. And it was these trajectories that enabled the contact with these beings that are more than human. I here and I want us to make a pause here, because now I'm going to concentrate a little bit on what the discourses that I talked about before bring to the table. It now that I went and dived deeply into the details of the life stories of people from the Greco family or the Migai family, then I made a pause and I realized, okay, but what does this mean for the idea of gypsiness, the idea of the gypsy? And I remembered that when I was doing my BA thesis, I every time I typed those words in Google Scholar or any type of academic search engine, what I found was not people, but a species, the so-called gypsy moth or Limantria dispar. And so there's another entanglement that is kind of washed away in usual understandings of the mobilities of Romani people that I hadn't focused on. I had mentioned it briefly, but I hadn't focused on. So I decided to dig a little bit more on this case. And I started to understand, for example, that there's powerful parallels between the discourses about Roman people and about these moths that were allegedly unintentionally introduced by an entomologist to the Americas, concretely in Massachusetts. And some people say that it was for profit in order to try to create more resistant silkworms for the silk industry. And interestingly enough, the labeling of this particular species or invasive species, which is more like a species brought by humans that reproduce in a new environment, justified expertise management and eradication policies in the United States for the last 100 years, including 2021, which was there was an outbreak during the summer in the East Coast of the United States. And that outbreak caused a very specific thing, which was that this coincided with the Romani movement in Europe and the United States, and they decided to change the name officially of the gypsy moth back to Limantria dispar. And this is what a Romani scholar from Rutgers University said to the New York Times. That's how they see us. We eat things and destroy things around us. What is she referring to? Well, she's referring to the Holocaust. And the use of this kind of what Chappendon calls frictionless metaphors, waves, flows, invaders, plagues, was one of the ways to justify the Holocaust and the extermination of Roma people in Europe. And this idea of the Zigeunerplage or the gypsy plague. So labeling. So one of the questions that I didn't ask myself back then is how these frictionless metaphors are used not only for human beings and to justify the extermination of human beings, but also the eradication of non-human beings like moths. And they're used as well to justify policies that kind of do not own up to the responsibilities that we have as humans when we change something around us and the feral effects, according to the feral atlas of Anat Singh, that this generates. So just to finish now, there's so many things that came to my mind now that Nick had introduced the idea of territories of life. For example, the relationship, the intimate relationship that Romani people have had to tobacco, a plant that comes from the Amazon. I don't know. That research needs to be done, and now I'm really excited to do it. But I think academic approximations to these entanglements are only starting, and are starting precisely because of this kind of dialogues that we have between subdisciplines in anthropology, which I'm very glad we were able to do before this particular talk with Nick. And thank you so much for listening to this. I know that it's a lot of information and it's very new and not very organized, but I'm really glad I could share it with everybody. So sorry I didn't have like a better conclusion, but it's still ongoing.
All right, wonderful. Thanks a lot, Esteban. And not only it was interesting, but also kudos to you and thanks for successfully making the effort to kind of speak to various themes that we tried to get going this year with STANDD, but also to the actual content from previous talks. So I really appreciate that, kind of getting some actual dialogue across the different events or meetings. Setrag, I see that you, so we'll start question period. I saw that Setrag had Mark, but now he's gone. So we'll open up the floor to anybody who has questions. I imagine it might take a few minutes. You can click the raise hand thing. You can write it in the chat, or you can just interrupt me and speak. But maybe just to start, just from one of the last things you were speaking about, Esteban, of the so-called gypsy moths, and I actually just so happened recently to be looking that up. I don't exactly know why, but I did remember that over the course of the summer, I climbed Mont Royal on some off-road places, and I was pretty impressed at how many caterpillars there were. And later I learned that it was of that kind of moth, and they were actually really everywhere. I couldn't I was trying to climb and I was killing them as I stepped and put my hands everywhere. Anyways, oh yeah, it's because I saw this news report recently, kind of talking about the dangers of the gypsy moth for lake pollution with nitrogen levels. Then it also said at the end, in about 3 seconds, that this is only every 5 years, and that the next year the lake returns to normal levels. So it seems to be like that there's a lot of, and I know I'm getting a bit metaphorical here, but it's getting me somewhere, I think, hopefully, that there's a lot of kind of craze and fear about these moths, right? And there is, to some extent, in some discourses, a lot of craze and fear, or at least kind of, reification of actual Roma people as, wild or unsavory, or, hard to predict, and things like that, outsiders, and potential threats, especially for kind of domestic orders. But then thinking, at least metaphorically, of how these gypsy moths, seem to be a bit different and peak sometimes, but then generally be there's some sort of homeostasis within the ecosystem, and that the moths aren't that horrible. So I just wonder, kind of, how, to follow the metaphor, how non-Roma people around Roma people in Colombia or elsewhere kind of perceive or talk about Roma people, and how that kind of might play into relationships between Roma and other locals in Roma's and the other locals kind of endeavors to enforce or reinforce their land rights, or their rights, vis-a-vis the state. Sorry for the convoluted comment and question, but thanks a lot.
No worries. I think there's one of the reasons why I focus both on experiences and practices and discourses is because many times there's like a huge gap between both, especially when it comes to Roma people. So in Colombia and in other places in the world, there's been like a constant relationship between Roma people and who they call Galle, or the non-Roma people. And it's usually a very productive relationship. Like, my great aunt used to say that whenever Roma families came to the hacienda where she used to work in, they fixed everything, because they came with the skills and just fixed the pots, fixed the pans, the tools, everything was sharpened, and there were new horses coming. So it was like, it was a way for haciendas and plantations that were far away from technical centers to become up to date. And Gabriel Garcia Marquez shows this very well in 100 Years of Solitude, where he talks about Roma people as the bringers of invention and technical wonders of the world. So it's and this is very different from, if, for example, if you read newspapers at that time, where people were saying Roma people are the worst, they are thieves, beware. So this idea of wonder and danger kind of went imbricated and went together. And I think we would have to, I would have to research and how does this relate to how people understand species like Lemantria dispar, you know, and this idea of wonder and danger, um, like like you said, there's a bunch of, and in general, what I've read in the discourse about the Lemantria dispar is just terror. It's just there's so many, and they're eating all of the trees, and it's more of the danger side of the equation, and less the romantic side of the equation. And I mean, this is what I could say about that. I don't know if I answered your question.
One thing I guess I want to hammer on a bit is, to some extent, kind of have you noticed any friction, like any problems, or to the opposite, any benefits for Roma people in, like when you were talking about campañas and to kind of work towards having their own rights in the new constitution, according to the constitution. Do you know if there's any kind of local support for Roma rights, or if there's any challenges to those rights, or do other local people not really matter in that game of power for your rights?
Because it has never been about strictly land rights. Paradoxically, this recognition of ethnic rights has gone very smoothly. They were recognized in 1997, and then right away, a couple of years later, there were already legislation recognizing them as part of the official ethnic groups in Colombia, and a presidential decree just 12 years later that kind of laid the ground for their inclusion in other laws, like the law for conservation of linguistic rights in Colombia, and things like this. So the fact that land was not a factor made it kind of easy to be recognized on paper. But once institutions had to start dealing with the fact that these people are mobile, that's when it got complicated. Because, for example, if you want to give somebody educational rights, you just, in Colombia, you just grant them an education in a particular school, and you grant them like a place in school, and that's it, in Bogota. But what if this person spends 6 months of the year in Bogota and 6 months in another city? So it becomes more complicated. So in the case of Roma people, it has always been about mobility. And the work of Mariana was really interesting because while she was doing her BA thesis, she found out how there was Roma people in the country tried their best to put in the law that the Compañía was a mobile ethnic unit, territorial unit, sorry. And nobody accepted that. Administrations didn't want to deal with the fact that a family could just transport itself somewhere else, although that's what happens in real life. So most people that, I mean, for the specific question of rights, the people that have the most against the Roma are bureaucrats and people that want to pin people down in order to govern them, you know? So that's the thing. But the families are not very numerous, so there hasn't been like a question of unrest in Colombia as it happens in Europe. That occurs more when you're talking about indigenous population or migration from Venezuela, etc. So it's a very particular case, the case of Roma people in Colombia, and that's why I wanted to bring it here to explore it a little bit.
Great, thank you. And we have a question from Debbie, but just before, Debbie, as you kind of maybe come on, just want to say that there was a comment for you, Esteban, from Viviane. I'm so sorry I have to leave early, Esteban. Truly fascinating work. Seguimos, and okay, I'm not even gonna try to pretend I can read that. I'm very sorry. I could, but it won't sound good. anyways, we have that, and then Caroline Siegel sharing an interesting article on the Roma by Zizek, so for further reading. Debbie, you're welcome to.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Esteban. Muchas gracias. I have a couple of questions. First of all, when you're speaking about the nomadism and the nomadic families, would you characterize most Roma in Colombia as being nomadic? However nuanced that might be. And how does it compare with some of the other Roma in other countries in America Latina? That's the first one. And then the second one, because you know I'm going to ask the question about language and translation. I'd like to hear some of your reflections on how you could superimpose this layer of analysis that's linguistic and language, because we know in translation studies that when we look at migration and immigrants to in immigrants today in different countries, not necessarily Roma, that the connections are made through the technologies and the internet, the cell phones, smartphones, and so that brings on a whole different nuanced discussion on communication networks. And I'm wondering if while you were traveling with the families, how was the linguistic landscape that was unfolding? And in a translational sense, was there translation between Romanes and Spanish going on? Were your discussions in Spanish always? And how would you self-reflect on your position as a potential interpreter or translator while gathering the research that you were gathering in your field work?
So at least in the Colombian, I'm just going to start with the second one and then go with the first.
Mm-hmm.
So at least in the Colombian side of the research that I did, I tended to rely on Spanish for two reasons. The first reason is that most Roma people don't want Calle to learn Romanes. So although I know a couple of words and whatnot, in general, I try to not be too eager, precisely because I wanted a relationship that was built up on trust.
Mm-hmm.
So many of the conversations were held in Spanish, although I can understand a little bit of Romanes, especially because Romanes has had a lot of contact with Colombian Spanish. So you can, some of the borrowings allow a little bit of understanding. But so in the case of language, in this language for me was also kind of an analytical tool, in the sense that when you're doing multi-sided ethnography, it's literally impossible to speak every language. So at some point, but it's also the same for people that are traveling. So if I was talking with people in Colombia that were migrating to the United States, for example, or had migrated to the United States, many of them didn't speak English. So they told me about their language troubles when they crossed the border, and then suddenly they have to talk in a different language. This, I mean, for me, it was fascinating to go to Pasto as well, because I went into this encampment to talk with people, having asked for permission first to the representative and everything. And then one of them was particularly interested in me, and I didn't understand until he started to speak to me in English with a really heavy Californian accent. And then we talked for a while in English, and he told me, yes, is that I'm American. I was born in the United States, and then I decided to leave, and now I'm in Colombia. So this also spoke to how cosmopolitan sometimes these families are, although they live in Athens. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of and it's on us to give them the benefit of the doubt as how smart, cosmopolitan, and impressive their minds are, as opposed to and they are bilingual anyway, so their Spanish was perfect, and their English was also really good. So like we didn't have to speak in Romanes proper. We did have though, and that's how I'm going to the second part of the question. We did have long debates around terms in Romanes. And one of the questions was like, how do you translate nomadism to Romanes? Nobody knows. It's not really a thing. And this is exactly why this elder, when they were taping this documentary, turned to her daughter and said, like, what is nomad? I don't know. And in Romanes, and she answered in Spanish, oh, that we travel a lot, que viajamos mucho. So, and of course they travel a lot. So he was like, oh, sure, no, that's what we are. The question is, so there's a lot of self-identification with the term precisely because of having mobile lives and mobile strategies to life. I wouldn't characterize all of the families as nomads in the sense of adjusting to this idea of the myth of the placeless gypsy that Kabachnik talks about. That nobody is unattached to place and nobody travels all the time, and this is taxing for the body, it's expensive, it's complicated in a country that has a lot of issues with violence. But of course there's a lot of mobility, and this is why I needed to trace the distinction between the words that have been used and the discourses that exist and the actual things that happen to people in their daily life. Did I answer? Yes.
Could I just piggyback with one little question?
Sure.
Have you seen, is there any influence from indigenous languages in the Romanes or in even when speaking to you in Spanish?
I don't think so. Maybe in certain, I mean, no, I will rephrase myself. The issue is that in a city like Pasto, to give an example, there's a lot of borrowings from indigenous languages like Quechua into Spanish. And of course they use them. But most of the people learn Romanes in private life and then Spanish to deal with others. So if there were borrowings from indigenous languages, it was in the times in which they were dealing a lot with indigenous people. And this doesn't occur that much anymore. It used to happen frequently. For example, when some Roma decided to bring a mobile cinema machines from Mexico into Colombia and then started to go around the countryside, setting up this mobile movie theater and showing it to people. And many of the people that used to love these movies were indigenous people in the countryside of Colombia. So maybe there was some contact there that I have identified. I haven't seen those, but I mean, I'm not a linguist, so it's gonna be something to explore further, I guess.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you.
Yeah, no
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you for coming.
Thanks, Eddie, for your questions. Also, gorgeous bookshelf. Before we get to
The bookshelves are getting more popular than I am.
yeah.
Yeah.
Gorgeous speaker too.
No.
We have just before we get on to Mariana, we have a question from Caroline, and she also has shared some interesting quote from the Zizek piece, I imagine. So you can check up on what she's got to share. But the question, I'll just read it now, unless Caroline, you want to hop in quickly. If not, I'll just read it. I cannot read it in your voice, though, nor will I try. How does the concept of multiculturalism function within the Colombian context, drawing on this idea of tensions, political, economic, ecological, in the Roma debate?
So multiculturalism has taken shape after the 1991 Constitution as kind of an official understanding of how the country works between a big mestizo majority and then ethnic groups. And these ethnic groups are basically Afro-Colombians and Black communities, indigenous groups, and the Raizal in the Caribbean islands that belong to Colombia, and the Roma. So, and it's very interesting because they have kind of created little categories legally that people have to conform to. So there's not a lot of fluidity, and there's not a lot of like debate around how ethnicities, how we are all ethnic if we start from an anthropological understanding of ethnicity. It's more about the nationals and the ethnics, which are weird nationals. It's a little bit how it's perceived. And so in the case of Romani people, there has been there's this tension between are we, when they come from Europe, they came originally from Europe, are they actual ethnic groups that were there before Colombia, or are they just migrants? And there's a whole debate around this idea of are there true ethnic groups if they're not tied to the land? And these are conversations that happen often. So people say, oh, but they're not ethnic groups because they're not indigenous, or they're not Afro-Colombian or whatnot. Eventually they won. Eventually they are now in the law. But the law is designed to be applied for the specific cases and mobilizations of indigenous peoples and Black communities. So it's definitely not adapted to the particularities of Romani people. So and the law, and everybody, I mean, here we've all studied how complex the idea of multiculturalism is, and how and the limitations that it has, especially in the case of territories, because of what we talked about, this idea of the isomorphism of place, space, culture, doesn't always work. Most of the time it doesn't work. So look, how do we deal with this in politics? I mean, it's an ongoing debate in Colombia, which is very fruitful. I mean, some of the things that I read in order to prepare this talk talked about territory being this processual entity, and many of the people that were thinking about this came from Colombia itself, precisely because of this ongoing situation. So yeah, I hope I answered. Sorry.
Caroline seems to be saying that that's fine. So now we have Mariana, and thanks again, Caroline, for your question and for your contributions to the chat. So Mariana, the floor is yours.
Yeah, so hello, thanks for the invitation, Esteban, for this conference. I think it's very interesting, like this topic related with Roma people. So first I wanted to talk a little bit about what I have say in my investigation. So that leads me to a question to Esteban. So for a context, I wanted to tell you that in general, people talk about Cumpaña as related to country. So people say Cumpaña of Venezuela, Cumpaña of Colombia, Cumpaña of Ecuador. But the relationship between Roma people in Colombia with the state and the politics that have come out of that relationship had created the relationship between Cumpaña and local fragmentations, such as Cumpaña of Bogota, which is the capital, or Cumpaña of Girón, which is another subdivision or sub-fragmentation of Colombia. And that is related with the Eurocentric logic of territory, which is precisely associated with the ownership of land and the territory as fragmented and related to colonialism and to capitalism, because it's the same logic that articulated the countries worldwide. So it's like an hegemonic way of seeing territory, right? But that contradicts the territory that is created by Roma people, and in general by many like populations like farmers and indigenous and Black people, because due to that perspective that Esteban was talking about, that is like an alternative perspective of what territory really is. The territory is created but by like three things, which are relationships, time and space. It's not like divided and it's not fragmented. And therefore the territory can be like not continued, like can be localized here and here and here, and it also can move with people. In like some Roma people of Colombia say to me that the Cumpaña was wherever Roma people were. So it is not associated with the ownership of land, but is created through the networks that Roma have. So in my thesis, I explore a little bit like family relationships, but I wanted to ask Esteban, and mostly because he related the subject of like the legislation and the administrative stuff. What's the role that the Cris Romani plays in connecting different Cumpaña that have been fragmented by the state, and how it creates tensions with the role of the representative that also the Colombian government imposed over each Cumpaña. I don't know if I was clear. My English is not that good.
It's okay. No, that was perfect. And thanks so much for the context, because of course there's a lot that has been written about Roma in Colombia that has not been like getting out there and published, especially in English. So for those that don't know, the Cris Romani is kind of their own way of doing justice. It's a gathering of elders that makes decisions concerning specific conflicts. And one of the interesting things that that Mariana made me think about when we were talking about her thesis was precisely this idea of fragmentation and whatnot. But going back to the interviews that I did during my PhD, I realized that a lot of people use the term Cumpaña much more fluidly. It's not only about nationalities. It's about, oh, in this place, there's mucha Cumpaña. There's a lot of Roma people, you know? And this was said by an elder from Pasto that I was quoting today. So when he talked about mucha Cumpaña, it was just that there were many different Romani families together in one space, sharing and relating to each other, which talks to this idea of how places and territories are created by the relationships themselves. So I would question the idea that Romani socialities are being fragmented by the state. I think that it's an added layer of political complications for sure, and it has created division and conflict and whatnot. But there's an underlying logic that is not imposed, which is Cumpaña is sociality, Cumpaña is relationships. And it's whatever relationships we're dealing with right now. Sometimes because of the importance and the strength of national borders, we talk about Cumpaña Venezuela and Cumpaña Colombia, because if you go to Cucuta, there's a clear border between both. And it was not created by them, it was created by the two countries that decided to put something there. But even while you're there, people are talking about the families as a whole. They're not talking about the people in Cucuta and the people in Venezuela. They're talking about the families that exist in that particular area as a Cumpaña, because that's how they work, because crossing the border is usually very easy. and families come and go get married in Venezuela, come to Colombia, buy some boots in Cucuta, and they sell them in Venezuela, and it was like this ongoing exchange of relationships. So of course the border is important, but I also think that this is the underlying logic of relationships that dictates what cumpaña is. And this talks to the idea of the CRIS. What is the CRIS? Well, it's an arbiting body inside Romani families or above Romani families, and is made out of people from different places that have different degrees of respect amongst themselves. And the Krisnitori, the leaders of the Romani Kris, are usually very specific people. And so many times, in order to solve a specific conflict that needs mediation, you need to communicate between localities to gather enough elders that can solve that conflict. It's not that usual anymore, but I did hear a lot of people saying, we need to pay a plane ticket for this person because this person will help us solve this conflict and stuff like that. So, so again, cumpaña is the relationships, the connections. It's not necessarily only the boundaries or the fragmentations. Yeah. I hope I was productive for you and your thoughts. Any I saw another question here in the chat, I think.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Mariana, and yeah, for that kind of in-depth question. And I think we can say that there's a lot of hope in the room today, and virtually a lot of hoping that questions are good, hoping that answers were answered. So here's the hope. Hope is not dead. Naeem, we have a question from Naeem in the chat. Naeem is in the room. So Naeem, would you like to ask the chat, or would you like me to read it? Okay. So Naeem was going to ask it.
Great. Thanks for the wonderful talk. Your fieldwork sounds really amazing. I really appreciate the detailed description of your methodology and technique. And I will, pick it up in detail and stuff like that. I was wondering how you solve the myth of facelessness. I do understand that it's complicated and a little more by fact that it's not the people they don't always move and etc. all the things, but in general, the general idea of the gypsy as a nomad, if it's introduced as a myth, I don't understand how a myth is not remaining after all of your discussion, and also how basically we do away with the myth in the first place. So also with the myth that that continental centric sort of approach that I'm probably coming from in what I'm saying right now. So and why I do understand that mobility is a much larger question in Colombia and doesn't just involve the Romans, right? But I also wanted to point out the happy coincidence of the talk that we had yesterday in religious studies and Islamic studies, so sort of group on Ibn Khaldun, who's known for the nomad sedentary transit, and people have been discussing basically applications of that in the Middle East, etc., or the Islamic world. And for example, there was it's a bit off topic, but there was this example of like how the planning is complicated by the fact that that urban planning nowadays in the Middle East is looking more and more nomadic, and so you can't really do the nomad versus sedentary planning as easily. But that's off topic. But yeah, I was just wondering if you take up that model, if it's something that speaks to you at all, and because just for context, Ibn Khaldun was basically saying that the nomadic life and the sedentary life feed upon one another, and there's a myth that one came before the other, but that myth is not true. In fact, the sanitary and the nomad were always basically interconnected and interdependent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm sorry if something of what you said didn't come through because of the audio difficulties, but I think I got the gist. I did look, I mean, one of the chapters of my thesis that it was not reflected here was about these ideas of nomadism versus sedentarism and how they were understood in Romani studies and elsewhere. What I thought was interesting for the understanding of how people decided to leave Europe and come to the Americas, Romani people, and this transatlantic like issues was precisely how there were actual mobile practices and strategies, but there was also these discourses around what is nomadism and what is sedentarism. And they were not necessarily always related. So for example, there were groups that came to Canada from Hungary that had been living lives that could be classified as sedentary for a couple hundred years that were understood as nomads by, for example, the sensationalist media in Toronto or in Canada. I haven't, I mean, I would have loved to be in that talk about Ibn Khaldun, precisely because there's a lot of ideas from that part of the world that I couldn't include in my thesis. But I remember reading about the Bedouin case, which talks to what you said about the relationships, the intimate relationships between those who are labeled as nomads and others. And I remember that there was even like shifts from one category to the other, depending on life courses and depending on historical pressures as well and whatnot. And it's something that was very similar to what ended up happening amongst Roma families that I talked to. There were some families that were in place, they bought territories. I put a quote there where there were some people that actually had land, and they were in place. They have warehouses or places where to do their trades. Usually they have to do with metal, so scrap metal or industrial steel works or stuff like that. And others that had still mobile strategies that were enabled by the places that these other families had. So they knew that they had where to arrive and put their tent because this other family was in that specific city, or they could use that warehouse to create more product to go and sell around the country later. So there was an intimate relationship between mobilities and immobilities, and this has to do with this idea of labeling who's nomad and who's sedentary in daily life. So as I brought one of those cases where they were labeling themselves as nomads, and the other family as sedentary, but they were both Roma. No, one's traded with gold, the other one's traded with land, etc. No, there's this kind of like bringing down those discourses on modernity and land and who moves and who doesn't move into daily interaction. But at the same time, the discourse of nomadism was horrible in the history of Romani people. I mean, it was the main reason that authorities in Europe declared in order to exterminate them or displace them or reduce them. And I mean, the most important case is that of Nazi Germany and this idea of the Wanderzigeuner, which is the gypsy that moves, which sounds like an oxymoron, but it's not, because there are a lot of people labeled as gypsies that did not move in daily life. So it's another topic that we could talk over and over again. But this is, if you check the anti-gypsy legislation all over Europe, it always mentions mobility and vagrancy. So and this is tied with German colonialism and the use of the concept of nomadism to colonize what today is Namibia, and the genocide of the Herero people, for example. So, I mean, there's a lot to talk about that subject. In this case, I wanted to focus on Romani peoples and Romani studies, but I would be honored to talk with people that work with these topics around the world and figure out what are the points of encounter, and it's a fascinating discussion for sure. Yeah, thank you so much for the question.
Thanks, Naeem. So we do have an additional comment from Mariana. I don't know if you want to read it, Mariana. If not, I will. It's just following up to your question and response. So yes, Esteban, thanks. I imagine that was if you had answered the question. I didn't mean to say Campania was only related to fragmentations. I just wanted to understand the tension between the legislation way that fragmentation had partially created and the KISS. So,
I mean, I just think that they're just too far apart. I don't think there has been a particular impact of these policies into how the KRIS actually works, except that many of the conflicts that appeared because of policies and politics ended up being resolved by the KRIS. So it was kind of like the KRIS remains as the biggest authority for Roma people, not the state. Yeah.
Mariana, if you have your hand up and you want to speak, go ahead.
Yes, thanks. So you consider that there are no tensions between like the representative of each compania and like the leaders and all like people that is in each compania. Like my question is between the representative and the other people. It's just like it works.
Yeah, I think the Roma have been used to this for a very long time. They have people that know about Romanipe, and they have people that know about the Gaje, and they're different. And everybody knows that the elders that know about the KRIS are above the people that work with the state and that know about laws and whatnot. And so, of course, there's been conflict, precisely because politics brings conflict, you know, especially when you're trying to translate the logic of the state into how Romani families work in daily life. But I've never heard somebody saying that a representative to the state has equal or more power than the elders in the community. Like everybody shuts down. Like everybody just doesn't talk when an elder comes to the conversation. Like when I've attended a couple of KRIS moments, the people that could talk and could organize were the elders that are recognized that power, not whomever, even if they have dealings with the state. So I think the issue is more like the KRIS has lost a lot of its strength, not because of the dealings with the state, but because of cultural change. You know, for example, the importance of pastors now. So now pastors, I think, are very powerful in some of the communities. That I didn't say before, but Romani families in Colombia are Pentecostal, as many other Roma around the world. So the figure of the pastor has become really important. But interestingly enough, many of them are part of the KRIS. So, you know, it's So there's so many things that we could talk about this, but I wanted to focus today on this relationship with territory that I thought was very fruitful. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks a lot for that ongoing exchange. Yeah, Caroline brings up the interest. Oh, no, never mind. I just have a question. You know, and I mean, I don't know like to what extent you're in ongoing contact, you know, with your friends and interlocutors amongst the Roma people that you're studying. But since you know the advent of the global pandemic, there's been pretty widespread restrictions on mobility. I wonder how, if at all, that has affected the Romani people you know, and how that might have be impacting their identity or anything like that, but more so just kind of technical level, any restrictions on their mobility, and kind of effects you've seen of that, and any thoughts stemming from that.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I think it's a very important one. I haven't gotten back to Pasto during the pandemic, unfortunately, so I don't know how they're doing where they live in tents, but I am in contact with many families that live in other parts of the country, and for sure it was, especially the ones that depend on trade and peddling and selling things from town to town, were hit really hard by the pandemic, precisely because of this. The country kind of clamped up on mobility, and you couldn't even go outside of your home and whatnot. Interestingly enough, as for everybody else, the experience was very different depending on the amount of resources that families could have or amass. So the people that depended on this daily grind had very, very complicated circumstances. But the people that had some capital accumulated found actually opportunities to travel. For example, many of the families had been trying to come to the United States as migrants. And it was very hard to do it beforehand because of all of the controls during the Trump era and all of this. Interestingly enough, because of COVID, all of those controls kind of eased up for certain countries, not all of them. The ones that were in the ban, definitely not. But for certain countries that were not in the ban, the controls were relaxed. So now there's a lot of Romani families that used to live in Colombia that now live in the United States, precisely because of this relaxation of controls. So for some people, it was immobility. For some other people, it meant true mobility and migration. So as always, you have to go like deep into case by case basis and different families and how they relate to their economies and their way of life, and what are the consequences of these overarching historical processes like a pandemic. Yeah, that's what I can say without having done research on it.
Interesting. It makes me think not only of how, like, where I've been in Canada since the pandemic, more affluent families have tended often to, at least at the beginning of the pandemic, seem to be faring off a bit better than others, although not that that's anything new, but just kind of saturated. But also, and this is probably just a stretch, but just in my own research with Mongolian nomadic reindeer herders, looking back, kind of both, at least like both in at the turn of the 20th century and in the past few years, more affluent families tend to be able to migrate longer distances, and that being because of they tend to have more livestock, more animals, and therefore more animals that can transport people and goods. Not to say that there's any like systematic theory we can make about affluence and mobility, but it is interesting to consider situations where affluence does increase mobility amongst nomadic people, when we might think sometimes of the classic, especially when we think of the typical romantic view of nomadic people that people have been pushing against, but this notion that you're kind of not attached to land, but also you can move, you can be a vagrant because you have nothing, therefore you can move. But often we see that there's the opposite. Not to say that if you're poor you can't move, but anyways, just interesting little resonances.
No, it's key, and I think honestly it comes down to what they call in mobility studies mobility capital, which is not always money, but it's a lot of different resources that you can hop onto when you need to move. In the case of Romani people, they have their own networks, which sometimes help people that don't have that much money. So they circumvent certain situations, but there's certain things that you cannot circumvent. If you have a visa, for example, a US visa, that's powerful mobility capital that some of the families had and some didn't. So and some either circumvented that, and so it's ongoing. It's a thing that we can think about, but I think it is very important, because this assumption that people that move are poor is pervasive in literature and legislation, especially people that are not the elite, a particular elite like nobility or whatnot. Especially in the case of Roma people, that the coupling was completely evident in migration records, and there's wonderful work around how families, when they came to the border with the United States, for example, the border authorities would ask them, "What are you coming here for? You clearly don't have any money." Crossing the Mexican US border in the 19th century, for example. And then the family would say like, "Oh, well, you should have said before that you needed proof of money." And then they would just pull out a sack full of gold and say like, "Is this enough?" And then they were like, "Oh, okay, come in," So it was, yeah, there's a lot of discussions around capital that I would love to have if we have another chance.
And we might wrap things up soon here, but just thinking of that, going from how capital can help increase mobility, do you think increased mobility helps increase capital? And now, of course, there could be capital in terms of, let's say, bringing in goods, but also other forms of capital, especially kind of social capital. Does an increase in travel reflect kind of beneficially for people, even just within the Romani community or anything like that? But is there kind of a feedback there between the capital to move and then getting more capital through that?
I think so, because the more some of the families traveled, the more places they had to return to, for example, and the more connections they could mobilize at a particular moment of crisis. When violence started in Colombia, the families that moved outside were the ones that had connections with people in Argentina or in Mexico or in Venezuela or in Ecuador, and they could very quickly follow those networks and those connections. The same thing happened in Venezuela when things went down in 2012, 2013. Some of the first migrants from Venezuela to Colombia were Roma and people with money. So it was the petroleum company owners and the very rich landowners of Venezuela and Roma families. Those were the ones coming to Colombia in 2012, 2013, which is very interesting to me. at least. And then followed, the rest followed. So yeah, I think they kind of feedback themselves also, because if you have mobile economic strategies, you know how to take advantage of mobility. For example, currency differentials. So if you, like when you have inflation and currency differentials, you buy something cheap in one place, sell it expensive in a different place, and then you make profit out of that transit. So, and that's kind of very usual for Romani people to do in the Colombian Venezuelan border, for example, or it used to be, I think, before the crisis. And also a lot of Roma went back and forth from Canada to the United States, for example. And that's something that I didn't talk about in this presentation, but it occurs in North America as well. Yeah.
Thanks. Well, I'll leave a few seconds for any other questions if there are any more. If not, Esteban, if there's anything else that you want to say, to get off your chest or anything. Mostly just kidding. You said a lot, but if you do want to say anything more, you can. Waiting for other questions. I think it's probably going to be it. But is there anything else you'd like to add?
No, I think I said a lot of things, and I would love feedback. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, thanks a lot for that. Perfect. Well, I mean, we can keep discussing, but I believe that questions are pretty much dried up, but you were actually very good at keeping your presentation under time. We do have 2 more speaker series meetings or events, depending on how they're defined, for the rest of the semester. Next week, I'll be presenting a wacko talk, Utopic Magician, Rude History of Our Sci-Fi Present. And then in early December, Philippe Douin will be giving another presentation. So we got 2 left. Yeah, and really appreciate you, Esteban, giving your talk, and thanks to everyone, and Caroline says thank you again. Thanks to everyone who participated in the question period, and again, Esteban, thank you very much for tailoring your talk to what we conveyed as a theme for the speaker series, and again for tying it in with other events. I really appreciate that professionalism and kind of enriching the actual event today. So thank you, everyone, and thanks, Esteban, and hope to talk to you soon, and hopefully you can connect with people here to keep the conversation going as you kind of move forward with this. All right.
Thanks a lot. I will leave my email in the chat just in case somebody wants to reach out.
Perfect. Thanks. And if anybody kind of feels like saying how they heard about this event, that's kind of that would be interesting just for us to know kind of what works, because there were some people I didn't know. There are some people I don't know in the room, so be interesting. But no need to say that. Perfect. Thanks. Well, I'm going to stop recording now, and but the event, the Zoom is booked till 4, so no one needs to leave now. But thank you very much. Recording.